Hare Krishna. So, we will in this lecture complete the remaining verses in the third chapter. So, in the preceding set of verses, Krishna had spoken about the dangers of performing vikarma and whimsical activities. So it's interesting to note that he had put both in the same category. Vikarma is one that is clearly against the Vedic injunction, and whimsical activities are maybe complying with the Vedic injunctions, but they are performed not in accordance to one's own varna and ashram. And Krishna said both of them have not good consequences. So Arjun is puzzled by this, and he will inquire more about this nature of apparent fall down. So we'll resume from chapter 3, verse 36. Arjun vacha athakena prayuktoyam papam charati purushaha anichannapi varshneya baladiva niyojitaha. Arjun said, O descendant of Vrishni, by what is one impelled to sinful acts, even unwillingly, as if engaged by force? So Arjun addresses Krishna as Varshneya, descendant of Vrishni, to bring attention to his own exalted lineage, and implicitly indicating that he's qualified to address this, because in his own lineage people are experienced in resisting sinful acts. So they know what is the dynamics, and Krishna knows. Of course, Krishna is God, personality of Godhead knows, but Arjuna is also referring to his exalted royal lineage. So why is he asking this question? Because he's wondering, and to some extent he's thinking about himself also, that the Vedas are very clear about what is pious and what is impious. And Krishna has explained it even more so. So then why do people perform sinful activities? And notice the use of the word baladeva, as if by force. So Arjun, because he himself is experiencing that, he's speaking with personal realization. He's saying that even though the person might intellectually know what is right, what is wrong, but it appears that there is another instigator that is more powerful, balad eva. That definitely there is an instigator that is more powerful, that is overpowering the discrimination of this person. Who is that? Is that the Lord? But the Lord can't be the instigator because he's everybody's well-wisher. Is that samskar? Is that previous impressions? But that can't be, because they are passive, they are inert, they need to be activated by the jiva. Now, empirically speaking, we know this as a fact, both personally and by seeing around us, that people may listen to pravachan, to instructions from saints and spiritualists. They may make resolutions to follow the path of religiosity and avoid sinful activities. But despite these resolutions, they continue to act sinfully, and they continue to lament also. Right? So it's a vicious cycle, that they resolve, they break the resolutions, they repent, they resolve again, once again they break the resolutions, and they repent again. So this is the third question by Arjun. So far, And Krishna will, in the rest of the chapter, he will address this question. Verse 37. Shri Bhagavan Vacha Kamayesha Krodesha Rajo Guna Samudvaha Mahashano Mahapapma Vidyanam Yahavarninam. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, "It is lust only, Arjun, which is born of contact with the material mode of passion and later transformed into wrath, and which is the all-devouring sinful enemy of this world." So Krishna right away gives him the summation of the answer. So in the next 7 verses, Krishna will essentially expand on this, next 6 verses, 7 including this, expand on this. But here he says that it is kamayesh. Kam is the desire for sense objects. And where does the desire come from? Both external and internal stimulus. Internal by previous impressions, by vasana, and external by what is circumstantially happening. So, Arjun may ask that in the verse 34, you had actually also said that anger is the instigator, ragadvesh, right? You said anger. And Krishna says true. But anger is not different from lust. When lust is obstructed, then it becomes anger. Just like milk becomes yogurt by the addition of acid. So lust arises from the mode of passion, and from lust in the mode of passion arises anger, which is in the mode of ignorance. Now one might say that if lust is the desire for objects, then one way to address this lust is by satisfying that desire. So the acharyas say that in the Mahabharata, in the Anushasan Parva, chapter 13, there is a verse that says that understanding that all that is available on earth in the form of food, gold, animals, and women is not enough for one person. One should go about with a peaceful mind. There is also a saying that that God creates enough for everyone's need, but even He cannot create enough for one person's greed. So that's the nature of lust. So it is said that when one has an enemy, there are 4 ways to conquer that enemy: Dan, Sam, Bhed, and Danda. Right? Dan is by appeasing it. Dan is by giving money, appeasing it. So lust is not going to get satisfied with Dan. In fact, it's like a fire. That the more you put into it, the brighter it'll burn. Nor can it be controlled by Sam or Bhed. Krishna says why? Mahapapma. Because it is very sinful. So we have this experience that good advice can only be heard by a certain category of person. If a person is extremely sinful, then no amount of good instructions will make any difference to the person. Right? So Krishna says Sam, which is preaching to lust, which is essentially preaching to the lusty mind, is not going to work. Or even Bheda, even division will not work. And because it is impossible to reach consolation with calm lust by Dan, Sam and Bhed, it should be destroyed by Dand. That is the 4th, which is by punishment. That is something that Krishna will now expand on. Next verse. Verse 38. Dhume navriyata vahane yatha darsho malena cha Yatholbenavrato garbhas tatha tenedam avratam. As fire is covered by smoke, as mirror is covered by dust, and as the embryo is covered by the womb, the living entity is similarly covered by different degrees of this lust. So Krishna had introduced lust as the primary cause of one's committing sinful activities. Now he expands a little bit upon lust. So here he talks about 3 levels of being covered by lust through an analogy. So when a fire is covered by smoke, it can still carry out its function, but it is somewhat obstructed. It still has heat and light, but the smoke is somewhat of an obstruction. This is the situation of the human life, where there is still the ability to perceive Vedic knowledge, to make advancements, but it is obstructed by the modes. Now, a mirror covered by dust will not be able to fulfill its function. So the function of the mirror is to reflect, and the dust will obstruct that function, but it's still a mirror. Somebody can look at it and say this is a round mirror, and there will still be will be some form of hazy reflection. So this is the situation of the soul in an animal form of life, where there is some consciousness, some awareness, but it is more or less completely obstructed. And the third situation is the embryo covered by the womb. So the embryo in the womb is completely covered, fully obstructed. The embryo cannot do any function. It cannot walk, it cannot stretch its arms, it cannot perceive, and it cannot be perceived. So this is the situation of the plant life, where the consciousness is so much covered that it is barely visible. So this is also a glorification of the human form of life, that only in the human form of life can one make spiritual advancement. Prabhupada says that by careful handling of the smoke in the fire, fire can be made to blaze. Therefore, the human form of life is a chance for the living entity to escape the entanglement of material existence. And the Upanishad is said that one who has this human form of life and does not use it for the purpose that it's been given should be considered to be Atmaha, to be the killer of the soul. Next verse. Verse 39. Avritam jnanam etena jnanino nityavairana kamarupena kaunteya dushpurena nalena cha. Thus the wise living entity's pure consciousness becomes covered by his eternal enemy in the form of lust, which is never satisfied and which burns like fire. So this verse is important because Krishna is revealing the characteristics of lust. So he makes 3 points over here for us to understand the nature of lust. So first he says is that lust is like fire. So just like fire cannot be quenched by putting fuel into it, lust cannot be quenched by satisfying it. So this negates the hedonistic approach that is proposed by many philosophers, that in order to transcend lust, one must satiate it. One must eat so much that one begins to get aversion to food. Right? That's the hedonistic approach. There was a Swami in India who basically said the only way to get over one's sex desire is to engage in indiscriminate sex, and then finally you will be satiated, and then you can transcend it. But philosophically we see, empirically also we know, that this never works. And here Krishna is philosophically also establishing that lust cannot be satisfied by cannot be extinguished by trying to satisfy it. Secondly, we see that Krishna defines lust as avidya. So vidya is knowing what to do, and avidya is the opposite of it. So he calls it avidya because it covers the real intelligence of the identity, the living entity. So the original avidya, the original ignorance is not having or becoming confused about the position of the jiva and the Lord. Right? That is the original avidya. And from that, essentially, so many forms of avidya manifests in terms of so many kinds of lust. Right? And that's why Krishna says that this is the eternal enemy. So ever since the jiva has fallen to the material world, he has been a victim of lust. The reason that he fell to the material world was because of lust. And nitya, in addition to eternal, also means constant, which means that as long as the jiva is in the material world, he is constantly accompanied by lust. And flipping it around, that the moment the jiva conquers lust, then he can escape from the material world. Right? So Prabhupada says, therefore this lust is the symbol of ignorance by which the living entity is kept within the material world. While one enjoys sense gratification, it may be that there is some feeling of happiness. But actually, that so-called feeling of happiness is the ultimate enemy of the sense enjoyer. In the Srimad Bhagavatam, in the 9th canto, 19th chapter, it is said that as supplying butter to a fire does not diminish the fire but instead increases it more and more, the endeavor to stop lusty desires by continual enjoyment can never be successful. Therefore, one should regard this lust as the real eternal enemy of the conditioned soul. Next verse. Verse 40. Indrani mano buddhir asyadhishthana muchyate eter vimohayatyesha jnanamavritya dehinam. The senses, the mind and the intelligence are the sitting places of this lust. Through them, lust covers the real knowledge of the living entity and bewilders him. So after having described the enemy, Krishna now describes the strongholds of the enemy. Like Arjuna is a warrior and his instinct is, okay, you have now shown me where an enemy is, who the enemy is, tell me where the enemy is hiding so that I can attack him. So Krishna reveals 3 places where lust is present. The first is the senses. The senses contact the object and there is the experience of good or bad based on the nature of the engagement. Like maybe something tasty is good and something that is bitter is bad. So there is an attraction and repulsion to the object of the senses because of the influence of lust. Second is the mind. So the mind is the repository of the impressions of the senses and the desires that come up as a result of these impressions. Right? So the senses may be feeling sweet and sour or hot and cold, but it is actually the mind that is enjoying or suffering. So the nature of the mind is that under the influence of lust, it will contemplate past enjoyment and plan for more of the same. And it will force the senses to engage in an according way. So in the past, if a person experienced some happiness engaging the senses in a particular way, maybe they ate a particular food and the mind said, oh, this is this is tasty, right? So now the mind creates the desire to eat more of the food. So that is the influence of lust in the mind. And the purpose of intelligence is to plan. So intelligence is the one that determines the course of action for the mind, right? So when it is contaminated by lust, the intelligence is always planning in a way to gratify the lusty desires, right? So in this way, the senses, mind and intelligence becomes the adhishthana. Adhishthana becomes the abode of lust. So they actually are compared to a huge fortified city of lust for manifesting calm, for manifesting desires, for enjoying the sense objects by the senses, for having the conviction to do it by the mind, and having the ascertainment for planning to make it happen by the intelligence. So Prabhupada says that the enemy has captured different strategic positions in the body of the conditioned soul, and therefore Lord Krishna is giving hints of those places, so that one who wants to conquer the enemy know where can he be found. Okay, next verse. Okay, verse 41. Tasmat tvam indriyanadav niyamya bharatarshaba papamanam prajaihayenam jnana vijnanashanam. Therefore, O Arjun, best of the Bharats, in the very beginning, curb this great symbol of sin, lust, by regulating the senses, and slay this destroyer of knowledge and self-realization. So this is the reason that Krishna had introduced the topic of lust, not to discourage us, that you are completely overpowered by lust, it's captured your mind, intelligence and senses, but ultimately he wants us to conquer it, right? So first he alerted us to the insidious nature of lust. So in verses 37, 38, 39, he talked about the detrimental effect of lust. Then in 40, he talked about the places of residence of lust. Now Krishna is giving clues to Arjun how to vanquish the enemy. So the rules of combat is that one should attack the enemy at its weakest place, right? So lust is sitting in the senses, in the mind and the intelligence. So stronger than the senses is the mind, and stronger than the mind is the intelligence. So given that the senses are the weakest, one should conquer lust at that point, right? So even though the senses may be difficult to conquer, but they are easier compared to conquering the mind and the intelligence. And how does one conquer the senses? By submitting to the regulative principles of spirituality. The whole process of in bhakti, the whole process of sadhana, Vaidhi bhakti. So Vaidhi bhakti is by vidhis, by rules and regulations. The purpose of these rules and regulations is to control the senses. And even the process of karma kand, nishkam karma, they are all anchored around rules and regulations, which are meant to restrict the senses. So once the senses are controlled, then lust can be expunged from there. Now, while controlling the senses, one should not neglect the intelligence, right? Because the intelligence is like the guard. The senses are like the locks, the mind is like the door, and the senses is like the guard. So if the guard is corrupted, then one can always pick the lock and force open the door. So that is why the injunction is that instead of relying on your own intelligence that is contaminated by lust, one should accept the intelligence of Guru, Sadhu and Shastra, which is reflecting the uncontaminated intelligence of the personality of Godhead. Now, Prabhupada makes a very interesting point in the purport about lust. He says, lust is only the perverted reflection of the love of God, which is natural in every living entity. Right? So, where does lust come from? So, we know that Krishna said that lust comes from a desire to enjoy the senses. But if you look at it even more deeply, then why is it so universal? Because lust is the intrinsic quality of the soul. But in the soul it manifests as love for God. So the difference between lust and love is that in lust the center is the self. One needs to enjoy one's own self, one's own senses. Love is anchored on service. That love manifests as the desire to please someone else. Like that's the difference. Even in more material relationships, you can see that when a man and woman come together in lust, then their desire is to experience the most sense gratification themselves. But when they come together in love, the desire is to make the other person feel happy. Similarly, from a more universal construct, the nature of the soul is to love, is to serve the Lord and to serve other living entities. But when it becomes contaminated, then the same love turns inward and becomes lust. So now the force is me. That everybody should satisfy my senses. So Prabhupada says that Krishna consciousness is so powerful that even a late beginner can become a lover of God by following the regulative principles of devotional service. So from any stage of life or from the time of understanding his urgency, one can begin regulating the senses in Krishna consciousness, devotional service of the Lord, and then turn lust into love of Godhead, the highest perfectional stage of human life. Powerful statements by Prabhupada. Okay, next verse. Verse 42. Indriyani paranyahur indri bhaya param manaha manasastu para buddhir yo buddhe paratastu saha. The working senses are superior to dull matter. Mind is higher than the senses. Intelligence is still higher than the mind. And he, the soul, is even higher than the intelligence. So Krishna had already established this hierarchy earlier on, and he's stating it again to make yet another point. So the senses are superior to the dull body made of the 5 gross elements because they are more subtle and they are not destroyed when the gross body is destroyed. The mind is superior to the senses because the mind sets the senses in motion. And intelligence is superior to mind because it functions in nishchaya sankalpa. So nishchaya means determination and sankalpa means the so nishchaya means determining the truth and sankalpa means conviction. So compared to the mind, the intelligence is stronger. But then Krishna introduces another entity in this chain, which is the jiva, the famous jiva, whose very form is Satchitanand, who is pure intelligence and knowledge. That is even superior to the body, the senses, the mind, and the intelligence. So Krishna is essentially recommending to attack from both ends. So the senses are the weakest points and the intelligence is the strongest. So the senses can be controlled by following the regulative principles of spirituality. The intelligence is controlled by somebody even more powerful than the intelligence, which is the jiva. So Krishna is encouraging Arjuna, encouraging us that by your conviction, so that's what the jiva can do. It can have this conviction that I will resist lust. And by following the regulative principles of spirituality, which minimize the engagement of the senses with the objects in a lusty way, one can, so to speak, burn the wick from both the ends. Okay, next verse. Okay, verse 43, this is the last verse of the chapter. Evam buddhe param buddha samstabhayatmanam atmana jahi shatrum mahabhao kamarupam durasadam. Thus, knowing oneself to be transcendental to the material senses, mind and intelligence, O mighty armed Arjun, one should steady the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence, Krishna consciousness, and thus by spiritual strength conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust. So in this concluding verse, Krishna is now once again endorsing the position of the jiva. So he says that evam buddhe, evam means thus, and the thus here stands for thus my teaching. So because Krishna is giving instructions to Arjuna, he is saying evam, by my teaching, buddhva, realize that atma, realize that you are the jiva, that is Satchitanand, which is distinct and superior to intelligence. Right? So he says, evam buddha param. That understand that the jiva is much superior to the intelligence. Because it sets in motion all the material things. It is the one that can make the mind atmanam fixed in the atma. So he says, he calls Arjun that you are mahabhavu. Mahabhavu means that one who is mighty armed. And Arjun is might called mahabhavu because he could conquer enemies. So now Krishna is saying, now show that you are really mahabhavu by conquering the enemy of lust. Okay. So what is the purport of this and the last verse? That the jiva, by listening to the instructions of the Guru, Sadhu and Shastra, should develop the conviction to make spiritual advancements. By following the regulative principles of spirituality, they should control the senses. And in this way, the mind and intelligence will also be conquered. And lust, which is the enemy of spiritual advancement, can be conquered. So in conclusion, we see that in the third chapter, Krishna has first talked about sakam karma, and then he talks about nishkam karma, the platform of acting without attachment. Krishna also talks about transcendental knowledge that has the power to purify one's consciousness and raise it to the mode of goodness. And in the final verse of the chapter, Krishna has certified transcendental knowledge as being able to award our intelligence the strength to overcome lusty desires. So after describing so many benefits of transcendental knowledge, Krishna is setting the stage for the next chapter, in which he will speak almost exclusively about transcendental knowledge. So with this we end the third chapter. Hare Krishna. All glories to Srila Prabhupada.